What's happening, everybody? It's been a minute since we've done one of these videos, but not because of really any fault of my own. It's just this is really the only break that we see in the MMA schedule. So it's been about a month since we've done a UFC card, and here we are. We're back at it using the Stokastic Sims in this video. I'm going to be breaking down this weekend's card, going fight by fight, giving my breakdown, giving out some picks to win, and showing you guys who it is I'm getting the most exposure to in my first run of the Stokastic Sim. So if you guys find this content helpful, do me a big favor, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you got any questions or comments, leave them down below in the YouTube chat. I do always read those and I respond to any questions we get. If you have any more in-depth questions for myself, come and hop into the Stokastic Discord channel. If you do sign up with any of our packages here, it comes with access to our Discord. And if you are looking to sign up for a Stokastic package, I found the Sims to be invaluable to me in terms of my MMA. I shouldn't say invaluable because I know the amount of money that I made on MMA DFS last year, and I won a handful of GPPs, and I wouldn't have been able to do it without our Sims tool. So if you guys are looking to sign up for those, which once again comes with access to our Discord channel, link is down below in the YouTube description box. But let's start getting to it, breaking down the first slate for 2025. Main event, it is Mackenzie Dern against Amanda Ribas. This is a rematch. We saw them fight. Let's see, what was the date now? So they fought all the way back in October 12th of 2019. Well, it feels like it was fairly recent that they fought, but it was actually 4.5 years ago that we saw these two match up. Mackenzie Dern was the favorite in that matchup. She was also fairly popular for DFS, if I remember correctly. And how the fight ended up playing out was Amanda Ribas kind of dominated the entire fight. She ends up winning 30-27 on all three judges' scorecards. Her output was fairly decent as well. If we were to project this out over a 5-round fight where she landed about 25 significant strikes per round, she landed a couple of takedowns. So if we were to get similar output in a win, we would be looking at something like 125 significant strikes for Amanda Ribas, 3 takedowns, some control time. So right around 100 fantasy points. And I do think that Mackenzie Dern has made improvements since that fight against Amanda Ribas, but there's such a big gap between them at the time that I feel like I have to favor Amanda Ribas to win, and probably in the similar fashion. Now, with that said, I'm not going to write off Mackenzie Dern in the main event, because if one of these two fighters is going to get a finish, I think it's more likely to be the cheaper fighter in Mackenzie Dern, who is going to have a grappling advantage in every single matchup that she ever is going to be in, but she also has a little bit of power on the feet, and Amanda Ribas has proven to be really chinny. She gets hurt a lot for WMMA. If you look back at Amanda Ribas, she was knocked out by Macy Barber. We also saw her get knocked out against Marina Rodriguez. And then there's also been a handful of other times where even if she hasn't lost by finish or been knocked down, she gets hurt fairly frequently in her fights, and we've seen her get knocked out on the regional scene. So that is a path to victory for Mackenzie Dern. All it takes is one takedown, and she could potentially land the submission, or maybe she could chin check Amanda Ribas in the matchup. So I'm picking Ribas to win, picking to win by decision. I think it's a pretty good fight to target for DFS purposes. I'm going to have a good amount of exposure to both sides, but if I'm just picking one of the fighters to win and trying to say who I'd want in a single entry lineup, I lean towards the Amanda Ribas side. Moving on to the co-main event, and Santiago Ponzinibbio against Carlston Harris. And Ponzinibbio, my initial thought was I kind of want to be fading Ponzinibbio at this point in his career because he's older. He's very clearly declining. There was a point in time where this was a guy who was ranked in the top 5 of the division, and then he suffered some injuries, had a long layoff, came back, and just hasn't looked quite the same. So there's a part of me that wants to fade Ponzinibbio. But on the other side, Carlston Harris is only a year younger than Ponzinibbio. And while Ponzinibbio is on the downside of his career, Carlston Harris never really had a significant career. There's not really been a place for him to fall from. He was never all that good. So the more I've looked into the fight, I kind of favor Ponzinibbio no matter where this fight ends up taking place. I think he's the better grappler. I think he's the better wrestler on the feet. I think he's the better striker and he's more output. There's some Carlston Harris fights where he does just about nothing. So the fight against Chaos Williams, he gets knocked out in a minute. The fight against Jeremiah Wells, Carlston Harris ends up with a comeback win and wins in the 3rd round, but he landed 5 significant strikes and no takedowns in that matchup. I just think Ponzinibbio is going to be the busier fighter of the two. It's not a fight I love to be targeting for this card, but where it's priced in the mid-range, if you get a finish out of either of these fighters, which is certainly possible when you consider they're, 38 and 37 years old. Yeah, 38 and 37 years old. You know, 2 older fighters, they both do have some power and finishing potential. So I think it's enough reason to get some exposure to this fight just because where it's priced. I'm going to favor the Ponzinibbio side. Don't really want to be going crazy with it, but I do have 32% of him right now. The 8K price tag, that's really what's appealing about Ponzinibbio. And also massive step down in competition. I think on paper, this is the easiest matchup Ponzinibbio has ever had in the UFC. Next fight, Cesar Almeida taking on Abdulrazak Alhassan. And Cesar Almeida is a fighter who I feel like is always somewhat popular on every single slate, and he never comes through. The problem with Almeida is he has very poor takedown defense. He also could get stuck on bottom at times. We saw that in the fight against Dylan Bucko, where he ended up in the first round. Yeah, we saw 4 minutes and 32 seconds of control time. So basically just killed the entire round. And then Cesar Almeida, while he does have power, we haven't really seen the finishes from him in the UFC. If you look at his career so far, he had a decision win on the Contender Series where he only landed 71 significant strikes. He had the finish in Bucko in the second round. But with that said, that was a fight where Bucko was doing really well in the first round, but just totally gassed. So it was just really a gas finish. Not like Almeida did all that much to initiate the finishing sequence. And he still only landed 29 significant strikes. There was no knockdown because it was just an exhaustion finish. He loses a split decision to Roman Kopylov, which I didn't think should have been a split decision. I thought Kopylov pretty clearly won. And then in what should have been a really easy matchup against Ihor Potieria, Cesar Almeida lands 57 significant strikes and wins a very boring decision that had something like 70 eye pokes involved in it. So now we've got a matchup against Abdulrazak Alhassan where both these guys have massive power, but they both strike at a fairly low output. Almeida's also $9,300, so he's pretty expensive. He's pretty reliant on a first-round finish to be in the winning lineup, and that's just something we haven't seen out of him all that much. I do think Almeida wins, but I think decision is the most likely outcome here just based on how his career's gone to this point. And on the Alhassan side, big power, but also pretty inconsistent. Another guy who's very much an older fighter at this point. He's actually going to be turning 40 years old this year, Alhassan. So I'm going to pick Almeida to win. I'm going to pick him to win by decision. But if I had to play one side of this fight for DFS, I'm going to lead towards the $6,900 Alhassan just because any win from him is going to score pretty well relative to his salary, whereas Almeida is going to need that early finish, which I just don't think is a super likely outcome. Next fight here on the card, it is Chris Curtis taking on Roman Kopylov. This fight card has a lot of fights that I'm just not super interested in rostering from a DFS perspective. This is one of them. You got a fighter in Chris Curtis who a lot of his fights look really similar. He's going to be pretty defensively responsible. He's pretty hard to hit. He is only going to box. You're not going to see a ton of leg kicks out of Chris Curtis. You're not going to see him look to wrestle in this spot. And he also has really good takedown defense. Fighters struggle to take down Chris Curtis. What is it on paper? Yeah, 82% takedown defense on paper. Kopylov only lands 1.2 takedowns per 15 minutes. So I think we're going to get a primarily stand-up affair here. It's going to be mostly boxing from Chris Curtis, and Roman Kopylov is going to mix it up a little bit more. But now with that said, the problem I have here is that Roman Kopylov, fairly expensive. It's also very difficult to knock out Chris Curtis. So I think Kopylov is the more well-rounded fighter and has more tools to win the fight. I don't know he's going to score all that well relative to his price tag because of how hard it is to put away Chris Curtis. So maybe Chris Curtis is just able to stay in the face of Kopylov and win a pretty close split decision. And at his price point, that wouldn't be a terrible outcome. But I don't see all that much ceiling from either of these guys. I don't think a finish is all that likely on either side of the fight. I don't think takedowns are super likely on either side of the fight. So it's not one that I have all that much interest in. Next fight, this is one that I have a lot of interest in, both for DFS and a real-life perspective. We've got Austin Bashi taking on Christian Rodriguez, and it's kind of funny that the UFC continually puts Christian Rodriguez in this situation. They give him young blue-chip sort of prospects, or at least prospects that the UFC sees as potential blue-chip prospects with really high ceilings. And more often than not, Christian Rodriguez is a really big underdog in these spots, and he ends up upsetting the favorite and kind of putting a young prospect off track a little bit. And I think the line is a little bit wide in this spot. But with that said, I still want to get exposure to Austin Bashi for DFS. And I don't like Christian Rodriguez all that much for this slate because I think there's so much more fantasy upside on the Bashi side. If you guys saw his fight on Contender Series, he was relentless with the wrestling grappling, ends up landing 10 takedowns before he was finally able to wear out his opponent and get a second round finish. And if you do look at Christian Rodriguez, oftentimes what we see happens against these young prospects is the prospects win the first round, But then they just find out they can't keep that pace that they're used to keeping. And then Christian Rodriguez ends up winning the second, third round and wins a 29-28 decision. If we do see poor cardio in this fight from Bashi, which is hard to say, he's basically dominated everybody he's fought to this point. We haven't seen him fight that much resistance. Then what could end up happening is the same thing happens in a lot of other Christian Rodriguez fights. Bashi wins the first round. He looks really good. He lands 3, 4, 5 takedowns. Everybody's like, oh my God, is this guy a future title contender? Then all of a sudden the cardio fails, and then you get a come from behind victory from Christian Rodriguez, which typically doesn't score all that well for DraftKings. But on the other side, if Bashi's cardio is able to hold up, this is where he's going to score extremely well. Because, I mean, he landed 10 takedowns on the Contender Series. That's what he's going to be looking to do against Christian Rodriguez, who really doesn't defend takedowns all that well, only 65%. It's just more so he is able to keep himself safe, and he's usually just able to outlast some of these younger prospects he's fought until they get tired, and then Rodriguez is able to find late success. So I don't really want to be taking chances on a punt in Christian Rodriguez, even though I do think the line might be a little bit wide. But if Bashi holds up and looks as good as he did on Contender Series, then I think he puts up a really big DraftKings score. So we've currently got Bashi projected for 25% ownership. I've got him in 36% of my lineups. He's a pay-up option. I want to be overweight to the field too. Next fight, another one I have a lot of interest in, Punahele Soriano taking on Uros Medic. And Soriano looked career best his last time out. He fought against Miguel Baeza, and it was a fight where, so a couple of things went on. Number one, I thought Baeza looked career worst, but at the same time, too, Soriano looked career best. Most importantly, Soriano's cardio looked way better than it ever has at any point in his career. He landed 331 strikes, 5 takedowns. He scored 10 gazillion fantasy points, absolutely broke the slate. And what I think is interesting about this matchup that he has against Uros Medic is that historically, Medic's cardio hasn't held up all that well. Super dangerous in the early going of fights, but when they get extended, he doesn't look all that great sometimes in the later stages of fights. So I do think that the first round is going to be Medic's to win, and he could potentially finish Soriano in that first round as well. But the more this fight gets extended with how Soriano looked in his last fight, maybe he could land some takedowns in the spot as well. Medic only has 55% takedown defense. It's something we've seen him struggle with in the past. Then you could see Soriano look dominant in the later round. So I love this fight. I want to be overweight to both sides of it. I currently have Soriano in 41% of my lineups at $7,500, and I've got Medic in 37% of lineups at $8,700. So relative to price, I like Soriano a little bit more, but I want to be overweight to both fighters. Really, really good DFS fight to target. I think the winner should score really well. Jose Johnson against Felipe Bunes, and Jose Johnson has just absurd dimensions for this division. You're talking about a guy who, well, I was going to say fights at 125 pounds, but he didn't make weight. So fighting at 127 pounds, or I think that's what he weighed in at for this fight. So he's going to be docked a percentage of his purse, but no concerns about this fight being canceled. But due to his dimensions, I think he's just going to struggle to defend takedowns at the 125-pound division. And that's what we've seen so far. He is only defending takedowns at a 38% clip. If you look at Jose Johnson's previous fights, Asuam Abayev takes him down 6 times. Chad and Hellinger takes him down 4 times. You had Damon Blackshear take him down twice. Jack Cartwright took him down 6 times on the Contender Series. And Ronnie Lawrence took him down 12 times on the Contender Series. And they've got a guy here in Felipe Bunes who that's kind of what he does as his path to victories. This is a guy who is kind of dangerous on the feet, but he's also somebody who's really active. He looks to shoot takedowns. He took on a UFC debut against Joshua Van. It was also a fight that Bunes took on short notice. And the first round was pretty competitive. It could have been scored either way. Van ended up getting the second round finish there, but Van's considered one of the better young prospects in this division. So I think the stock went up for Bunes in that loss. And now I think he's getting a pretty favorable stylistic matchup against Jose Johnson, where he's also the underdog. And when you consider that Jose Johnson doesn't defend takedowns well, and Bunes is somebody who's capable of landing takedowns, I think that's the path to victory for him, and it's also one that should score pretty well. So 23% ownership on Bunes at $7,600. He's one of the cheap value options that I'm definitely liking for this slate. Next fight, we have the aforementioned Ihor Potieria taking on Marco Tulio, and I think that Tulio is the much better fighter in this matchup. He's also very, very expensive. He's one of the most expensive fighters on the entire card. So then you run into this issue of Tulio probably needs an early finish while also needing some of the like Bashi type wrestlers who are pay-up options to not score all that well to be in the winning lineup. And it's just kind of hard to bet on those super early finishes because more often than not, they don't end up materializing. And if you look at Marco Tulio, 2 fights on the Contender Series. The first one goes to a decision. He only lands 48 strikes. Second fight, he ends up getting a second round finish. But also the output wasn't crazy high or anything like that in this spot. So, it's certainly possible that he gets an early knockdown against Iho Potieria. It's just not typically the situation I like to bet on with my DFS lineups. If I'm paying up for a fighter, it's either somebody I'm really confident could get an early finish, but I prefer it to be via grappling and get the submission, than somebody I think is kind of relying on the early KO. So picking Tulio to win, pick him to win by KO, but I'm going to prioritize spending up for other fighters in this spot. Ihor Potieria, if you want to take a punt on him, that's okay, but I'm not going to prioritize him or anything. Thiago Moises against Trey Ogden. I feel like Moises, I was never really high on Moises as a prospect, but I feel like he's slowly regressed in his recent fights, even though he's not all that old. In theory, he should be in his prime. He's 29 years old. He turns 30 in a couple of months, but I just feel like he was a better fighter at like 27 and 26 years old. If you guys remember, he went on a run to open up his UFC, well, not exactly to open up his UFC career, because he made his UFC debut against Beneil Dariush. Super, super difficult debut. He loses that fight. Then he has a win against Kurt Holoba. He loses against Damir Ismagulov, also a really tough fight. And then you see him rattle off 3 pretty quality caliber wins in a row. Didn't look good in the first round against Michael Johnson, but ends up getting, it was kind of like a weird pulls guard, gets a hold of Michael Johnson's leg at the start of the second round, then submits him, gets what his age is a really good win against Bobby Green, beats Alexander Hernandez, steps into his first UFC main event, and who they give him, Islam Makhachev. So obviously he ends up losing that spot. And then he's just kind of been like, hey, he looks decent in one matchup. He looks terrible in another fight. He's just been a guy who's kind of hard to read on. And I thought he looked as bad as he's looked in a while in his last fight against Ludovic Kline. And now you've got a matchup against Trey Ogden, who's kind of perpetually been underrated in his career. And he's proven to be a pretty good minutes winner while being a guy who doesn't score all that well for DFS purposes. Only lands 3 significant strikes per minute. He also has been successful with takedowns in some of his recent fights, which is something that Trey Ogden did not do when he first entered the UFC. I just don't know if that's a path that he's going to want to take against Thiago Moises, because I think Moises is the better grappler of the two. If Ogden shoots takedowns, I think he could land them. I just don't know that's what he wants to do in this matchup. So I'm kind of split on this. I don't have a massive amount of interest because I don't think the winner is going to score all that well. It's priced in the mid-range, so even 80 to 90 fantasy points could end up being okay at those price points right around 8K. I'll lean a little bit towards Moises because I think he's the more talented fighter of the two, but I don't know. I don't trust him either. I don't want to be all that exposed to this matchup. If I look at my initial exposures, I have 22% of Thiago Moises. And then on the other side, I have, let's see, what do I have of Ogden? And I've got Ogden just in 7% of lineups. I'm not going to outright fade these fighters, but definitely not a fight that I'm going to have all that much exposure to. Moving on to the next fight on the card, we have Preston Parsons against Jacoby Smith. I'm a little surprised Jacoby Smith isn't a bigger favorite because I really do like him as a prospect. Certainly one thing that plays a part of this, he doesn't have all that much experience. This is going to be his first fight actually in the UFC. Before this, he made his appearance on the Contender Series and looked really good in that matchup. And then with it also just being a short notice fight that he took up, I guess maybe it was hard for the bookmakers to make him too big of a favorite. But not only do I like him in this matchup, I like him to score pretty well in a lot of his wins. In his fight on the Contender Series, we saw the ability for him to land takedowns. We saw the power on the feet, and then also was just able to wear out his opponent without ever looking like he was slowing down. This is a guy who has a very high-level wrestling background, and we saw it on display when he landed 7 takedowns on the Contender Series. And he's got a matchup here against Preston Parsons, who, while Parsons is going to be the fighter who went through a full training camp for this fight, he didn't look all that great in his last matchup against Oban Elliott, and it was a fight where I was very much on the wrong side. I was on the Preston Parsons side a little bit more than Oban Elliott, whereas the field was more on Oban Elliott, and I felt like I overrated Parsons after that fight was over. I thought he was wildly unimpressive. His cardio didn't look all that great. His wrestling didn't look all that great, and that's really where I think Jacoby Smith could dominate this fight and land a bunch of takedowns. So another pay-up option that I like quite a bit. Jacoby Smith, he's definitely one that I'm going to be prioritizing. I currently have him in 43% of lineups at $9,400. So among some of the other super expensive guys we've talked about, like Cesar Almeida, or who else were some of the other ones? A couple ones that we haven't talked about yet. Roman Kopylov at $9,100. There's also Aliev at $9,500. So the super expensive pay-up options who are well over $9K, Jacoby Smith's the one that I have the most interest in and by far the most exposure to. My first set of lineups here at 43%. He's going to be in somewhere around half my lineups by the time I finalize everything. Next fight here, it is Ernesta Kareckaite against Nicole Caliari. And for Kareckaite, her fight on the Contender Series was one that was super exciting. There was a crazy amount of output on both sides, 184 significant strikes to 168. She goes into her UFC debut against Barbosa, and there's a little bit of hype there because of the amount of output she had on the Contender Series. And then fighting against a slightly better level of competition, she just didn't hold up or look all that good. She ended up losing the decision, only landed 53 significant strikes, and now she's expensive. It's just a price tag that's going to be hard for me to pay up for. And then on the other side with Caliari, not a fighter that I'm crazy high on or anything like that, but for such a minimum price tag, fighters who are priced right around that $7,000 salary or below, she has some wrestling ability. And if she's able to win and land 3-4 takedowns, that could be enough for her to be in an optimal lineup, especially if some of the fighters like Jacoby Smith or Bashi end up with really big scores and just need a punt somewhere. So as far as a punt goes, I have some interest in Caliari. She's actually one of my favorite sub 7K fighters, or the fighters who are around that price range. I'm not going to pick her to win. I think that it should be a decision win for Kareckaite. But with that said, I think there's a little bit more upside relative to price tags on the Caliari side. Magomed Gadzhiyasulov against Bruno Lopez. A lot of people are low on Gadzhiyasulov for good reason. His last fight against Betr Bonus was one that I was high on for DFS. This fight was very highly rostered overall, and it didn't end up scoring all that well. There wasn't the finish that we were all expecting. I think it was like minus 500 or minus 600 to finish inside the distance, and it ends up going to the judges' scorecards. It was also a split decision where Gadzhiyasulov looked pretty tired in the later stages of that fight. So people are low on him as a result of that. But at the same time, too, Bruno Lopez fought against Betr Bonus on the Contender Series and got knocked out. So when we're looking at that, I kind of have to think that Gadzhiyasulov's win over Ribeiro, I think it's a little bit overrated how poorly he looked in that matchup. And then also Gadzhiyasulov is a Russian who has the ability to wrestle. And I don't know that Bruno Lopez is going to be able to defend his takedowns. I think that's something that's a little bit of a sneaky upside for Gadzhiyasulov in this matchup. He landed 6 takedowns on the Contender Series. Even in that crappy decision win over Betr Bonus, he landed 5 takedowns. We could see 5, 6, 7 takedowns out of Gadzhiyasulov, where he also has some of the finishing equity in this matchup. So I do like the Gadzhiyasulov side. I do think this fight, both sides, either one of them, they both have big power. There's knockouts that are live on both sides. But if it goes to the judges' scorecards, I do think there'll be a little bit more upside on the Gadzhiyasulov end just because of his ability to wrestle. So Gadzhiyasulov at $8,800. I have 39% of him right now. I might dial that back a little bit as I get closer to lock, but he's the side of the fight that I like targeting, and I think he's a pretty high upside GPP option. Couple fights left here. Fatima Kline against Victoria Dudakova. It's not all that long that Dudakova was the fighter who was like a -7, -800 favorite against some of the newcomers to the UFC 115-pound division. But what has happened since is Dudakova has kind of been exposed as not all that great of a prospect. And while Fatima Kline did lose her UFC debut against Jasmine Jasudavicius, it was a pretty good showing out of her. She took the fight on really short notice. She was fighting up a weight class. And honestly, I thought she looked like the more skilled fighter between her and Jasmine. It was just that Jasudavicius was way too big for Kline, and she wasn't able to deal with the difference in strength in that matchup. That shouldn't be an issue against Dudakova. And then also Dudakova only defends takedowns at 50%. I think Kline should be able to land takedowns. I think she's the better striker. I think she has more finishing equity. The problem is that she's $9,800 in a fight that is more likely than not to go to the judges' scorecards. So I'm going to find it very difficult to pay all the way up to Kline. If I have the salary to get up to her, cool. And I'll be okay with doing it. But $9,800, I'm going to have fairly limited amount of exposure to her just because of what her price tag is. And now finally, the first fight on the card, we've got Aliev taking on Joe Solecki. Aliev hasn't fought in just about 2 years now. So he's been away due to injury. I don't know exactly what kind of form he's going to come in. It's always hard for us to know when fighters have these really long layoffs. One thing that separates a sport like UFC from maybe like NBA or NFL, you can kind of see people's declines happen more gradually. But sometimes in the UFC, a fighter takes a year, 2 years off, and they come back and look totally different in either direction. Sometimes they've improved a lot. Sometimes they regress. It's always hard to know what to make of fighters off these really, really long extended layoffs. But Joe Solecki's never been a fighter I'm all that high on. He's somebody who's very reliant on submissions to win his fights, and he does it despite not being somebody who's a massive wrestling threat. So a lot of times what happens with Joe Solecki is he gets taken down. Almost he'll invite the takedown. He'll allow himself to be taken down because he trusts his grappling ability so much and his ability to get submissions off his back. The problem is you have a fighter here in Aliev who I think should be able to stay safe on top. So I think the way this fight probably plays out is Aliev just lands 3 takedowns, plays it really safe on the top, doesn't take too many chances, doesn't hunt for finishes, doesn't unleash too much ground and pound. Just get one of these fights where it's like 3 takedowns, 13 minutes of control time, and like 60 strikes landed or something like that. And he scores like 80 to 90 fantasy points in a win, which is okay, but just not really okay for this slate relative to his price and some of the fighters who are priced around him. So not a fight that I'm going to have all that much interest in. So other than that, guys, that's going to do it for me. If you haven't done it yet, like the video, subscribe to the channel. If you want to sign up for any of the MMA packages that we have here at Stokastic, we've got our Sims package. We've also got our data package. We have our single lineup Sims where you get hand build lineups, and then you can simulate them to see if you hand build the single lineup, how that'll look. Links down below in the YouTube description box. That comes with access to our Discord channel. Thank you guys very much for watching. Good luck, and I'll see you back here next week.